All right, so let's get started. So pretty much continuing where we left off from last time, right into the Photoshop stuff. And actually this might be helpful for really all the classrooms that are in here right now. And just as a reminder, of course, that's why the YouTube is available. So even if you didn't get something out of your rotation, maybe another rotation went about something else. Anyway, it's a resource that you can obviously use even years from now, right? Just because I don't delete them. Anyway. So I wanted to continue about some of the elements, especially in this particular drawing. You know, for instance, I definitely want to start to materialize it, right? And start to think about maybe either changing it or keeping things the same, or how do I make this look realistic without just splatting some color on this or texture? How do I get the scale real and overall start to be a beautiful drawing rather than just a computer rendition of something? How many of you guys have heard of AI? Right? Obviously, ChatGPT is getting up there in the legal system and all that kind of stuff. There are some pretty cool ones for architecture. However, when you use them, they look good if you kind of, the first 10 seconds, but once you actually look at them, there's actually a lot of things that are wrong, right? So it's really not getting there yet, and thank goodness, because, well, then we'd be out of a job, right? Unfortunately, what I'm trying to say is there's always going to be the creator involved, and what he or she actually knows is really how well they're observing reality, right? So for instance, last time we talked about, understanding the reflections on the windows, right? And starting to mimic those elements. Understanding that mistakes in digital work actually make things look more human, right? So being able to apply those certain elements. Anyway, I'm just gonna get right back into it. We'll probably complete the windows kind of just as a capstone, maybe kind of as a reminder. But let's go ahead and fix the roof and other things like that. Not sure why my computer's so slow this week, but hopefully it'll kick back. It's not that large of a file. But yeah, maybe first things first, let's talk about the roof. Maybe I'm gonna leave it metal just because there kind of is a metal texture here. However, there's a lot of things I could do. So maybe let's test a few things and let's grab some materials. So just like I was explaining last time, we can do like roof tile texture, right? That texture is really the most important word there. And for the most part, we want to get something that generally looks flat because we can always add something to it. We don't really want necessarily a whole lot of shade and shadow because again, that's something we can add to it. So something relatively flat like this, there's a little bit of shade and shadow in there. That's okay. That's kind of where it's supposed to be. But keep in mind, if you got two shadows going two different directions, it immediately makes the drawing look off, right? So, something like this I wouldn't choose, right? Because there's clearly a bright spot where, the rest is kind of dark on the edges. That one's probably not bad, but there's not a lot of tiles there to work with. Some of these have, like stuff on them. Some of them just look too flat, so you don't really want to use those too. So anyway, picking the right one is half the battle as well. So keep that in mind. That one looks pretty good though. Kind of has some nice, I like kind of the jagged edge to it. It makes it look a little more realistic to me. So I'm going to go ahead and save that one. So I'm going to open up in a new tab. You could also just do the image. So open image in new tab. That's what I prefer. So save image as. We'll call it roof tile, and I'll go ahead and put all these in the same spot. Let's get a couple more though, so I don't have to keep coming back here. Let's try metal roof texture. That one's pretty good, but you see what I mean? There's kind of a highlight spot. You don't really want those things. This is actually more palatable because again, we can add that sort of shade or that shine, our own way. So that one seems pretty good. I forgot. Google image, right click, save image as, or new tab, then save image as. We'll call it metal roof. Let's gather some other materials. I definitely wanted to maybe talk about brick and stone. Stone is probably the hardest thing to render, right? As you guys know, and maybe like how Escamilla went over, do we color in every single stone, right? No. So why the heck would we do that Photoshop? We wouldn't, right? So there are actually two ways to go about it. You can brush it in, knowing a little bit about the color theory and, kind of getting the right ones. You could draw those in manually, right? However, we could also get other stone we can erase those lines that we have, and we can start to fade it out a little bit in areas, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a hard line. It just needs, again, to represent stone. However, we're going to attempt it today, and maybe some brick. So let's get a brick texture. Like I said, a flat texture will do. That's kind of got a highlight in it. That's pretty flat. I don't know, I like the color disformity. Something that's like one color, it's like, you know, there's not enough texture there to work with. Something like that's going to be really hard to tile, even though it looks good. That's just computer generated. It's really flat. So something like this, where it looks like somebody actually already tiled it, right? It's kind of nice to have. So let's go ahead and open that in a new tab, save, and we'll call it brick pattern. I might spell it wrong, but I guess that's all right. I know what it is. And the last one, let's maybe go with a stone, or even a stucco too. We need a stucco, but I can't just type in stucco, right? I gotta type in stucco texture. Ah, there we go. Right, so I can get that loose stucco feeling, right? That's pretty nice. That's called Venetian stucco. There's so many different ways to plot stucco. So what I would say is, well, test some things out, right, for sure. Very similar to, you know, what you guys did in freehand, but already right away, you should be able to notice that, I don't know, if I was really good at freehand and I have some markers, that is possibly the quickest way to get an idea across. What we're doing right here is more like maybe close to your final, right, schematic design. You've already picked out all the materials, you already talked about them with your professor and why they're that way. You've already talked about the event that's going to happen. So this is more of a final drawing, I would say, rather than say like a sketch out there or like process. But as you can imagine, it does take a little bit more time in basically finding the right ones. That looks pretty good. Again, I just kind of want that soft texture. Save image as. We'll call it stucco. Anyway, we have plenty to choose from and plenty to work with. So let's go ahead and work on the fascia boards and the roof first, right? So as we know, we could probably use the magic wand tool to get most of this, right? So I can go back to my lines, probably get most of that in there, right? I could change my tolerance back to its default of 32 and get a lot more. But essentially what I want to do here is actually, you know, basically fill that in the right way. So I'm going to go ahead and place bedded. Let's try that tile first. Holy cannoli. Right? So I'm going to hold shift, that way it at least stays proportional first. I can always line it up. And as you can imagine, that is probably the worst thing I've ever seen, right? It's way too big. So we can of course condense it to a better scale. Something like that, maybe 3 per one of these tiles is about right. Even arguably then, this is kind of small. One thing that I could do to give it that incline though, right, is of course hold option or shift, right, or not hold shift, and kind of squish them a little bit, right, or stretch them if you have to, right. In my case, you know, I'll actually pop this up a little bit because I know that these are going to have little ends to them, right? So I'm going to have to fake those a little bit. That looks about right. Not too bad. Enter. I'm going to go ahead and take that roof tile. I'm going to go ahead and copy it, right? Oh, and get off my selection tool and just move that over. Basically trying to align it up as much as possible. Paste again, so on and so forth. Sometimes I'll go in a little bit more so I can really spice it up. I don't want it to look like to somebody that it is tiled, right? How's it going? Right, but these are essentially the tile parts that I do want to keep. So I'm going to basically go back to my roof tiles. I'm going to select the inverse and subtract, right? Or in this case, erase. So kind of magical there. It even got some of the line. Again, I kind of want those little bits of mistakes to make this, right? first things first, I mean, it's really, really heavy compared to the rest of the drawing. So I'm going to scale that back. You know, my favorite number, 42, at least test it out first. That's actually probably pretty good. What we're going for is a texture of it, not this realistic drawing. However, I'll bring it up a little bit because I do want to see that color a little bit more. However, I could also just adjust some things. You know, we could look into the brightness, right? We could get, obviously that's going to change our color a little bit. I could add some more contrast. And as you can see, it's going to make some things a little bit more rich. I kind of like that extra contrast, right?
Can you change the color completely? Like
You could, right? So if I went to adjustments and I went to color balance, I could also replace a color, right? So I could choose a certain element. Now this kind of gets a little harder, but for instance, I chose that orange. I can dictate how fuzzy, like how much of that orange around it I want to select, and then basically change that color, right? So in my case, I don't know, maybe I want blue tiles, right? Yeah. But yeah, absolutely possible. The last thing I'd like to touch upon is, well, we kind of want that specular highlight. Do you guys know what a specular highlight is? Right, it's usually on anime, it's on their eyes, and they go, ah, and you see like the light reflections on their eyes. It's also missing on the moon, which is weird. But we do need to put it on this roof. So I like to brush it in, right? So I'm gonna get my roof tiles, B for brush, and simply brush that in, right? And what it is really just kind of a bright spot on the tiles, right? So I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger of a radius and show you what I mean, right? Obviously not that. I'm gonna get some white. You could actually fade it like a little bit of yellow too. I mean, you could get fancy with the spices, right? But we kind of want to have that in there, but we want it only on the roof tiles. So another thing that I could do, I may need to select those roof tiles again, or, you know, I think in our case it's kind of easy. Oh, there we go. So I only wanted to apply to that. So again, my brush tool, I kind of want that brightness over here, a little bit there, right? Just enough to change some things up, right? Maybe not that hard of a line either. And it looks like I may have missed some of my selection, so there we go. Roof tile, brush, there we go. A little too much. Maybe I want some more fuzziness, it's kind of hard. Right, so I could also darken it a little bit, right? Maybe I want some more richness. So I don't necessarily have to brush things all the time either. I can use other tools such as like a burn tool, which some like take away color, some like add a little bit more vibrance. So feel free to kind of mess around with these, like dodge tool. If you can see kind of what it does, it's very subtle, right? But it actually just brightens some things. Burn tool I actually particularly like because it, you know, it makes things dark, right? Of course I can change the hardness, right? I can do a lot. But again, I'm just adding some anomaly in here because in the overall, right, I want the effect of those tiles. You see that? We changed it dramatically, right, from at least that initial image. But as you can tell, especially digitally, I usually do things much lighter, right? And the reason is because when we print it, I may have said this before, but it gets 50% darker, period. Like I mean, unless you go buy a $4,000 true color screen, and they do make them so that you can get the exact color that you do see on the screen, but we just don't have that technology in our, and most architectural firms don't have this expense either. It's more like Pixar and animation studios and things like that. Which reminds me of Studio Ghibli, if you're a fan. Very good at this. You know, and I watched actually some Japanese tutorials when I was in tech, and I translated them, and I was like, you know, this is great. I'm learning from animators, right? Because they didn't have a lot of architectural videos when I was learning Photoshop. So I learned a lot from actually other animators. So we've got a roof. Let's talk about that fascia board, because it's kind of weak, just kind of white right now. So we might need to make a new layer, call it fascia board. But we essentially need to get all these elements, right? So luckily you're using a drawing that you already know about, right? You've already sort of tested little colors and things like that. Like I said, this is more like that final drawing, not necessarily unless you get really fast at it, you know. It's not usually your process drawing. Anyway. However, it does pay pretty well. I will say I've got hired at a firm just doing this alone for $125 an hour. So it is well needed. Now, I'm really good at it, and it only takes me 3 hours. So, um, obviously you can't start there. But what I'm trying to say, guys, is this is definitely a marketable skill, right? It's definitely something you want to perfect on your own in studio. That way you can show off your portfolio and be like, look, I can do all of this, right? Doesn't look like the magic wand's going to help us too much right here, so let's try and bring it down to maybe 25. Again, holding shift. Not quite, there's just too many open lines there. However, let's keep going. Let's see if we can get everything else. For the most part, it looks like it's mostly a closed line drawing. Of course, we'll want to get maybe, all the lentils eventually, but clearly most of these are actually squares and rectangles and things like that, so it shouldn't be too hard to actually fill in some of that stuff. But let's just get those fascia boards. And it's open there, but it's okay. I'm really just using this so that I can get, a better, I don't have to do as much work when I brush this in. There's some fascia. I think there's some fascia. Oh, looks like we missed a piece. That's okay. Well, I have to add that one back. But let's go ahead and brush that in on our fascia layer. So again, I just go to that fascia board, brush tool. I'm gonna go with maybe like a, I don't know, black. Usually goes good with that tile. Maybe like a dark brown. Why not? So where your color theory comes in, right? I'm gonna lighten it up a lot, so the darker the better for me right now. But I just want to brush that in, and of course, kind of lightly, right? It doesn't need to be perfectly filled in. In fact, I want sort of that anomaly, right? Starts to blend in with that shadow a little bit more. Oh, see, this is what I mean by accidentally have something open. It's not gonna help you so much to use that. However, we can go like this and fill it in. We can get that piece. That piece up. It gets a little bit more than we wanted. You can always trim it off with stucco or another element. To me, it's always been more like digital painting. I definitely have fun with it though, right? Always putting some sort of character in there. Usually I put the Beatles, Crossing Abbey Road. I had a friend who always put Angry Birds, and he'd make them so tiny, and it was funny because eventually we caught on to him, like, where's the Angry Bird? He'd put like little silhouettes of piggies and things like that. Not saying that you should do that all the time, but you can have your own style about this, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be always with your scale figures, but you definitely want to develop a digital style. So fascia board's looking pretty good. I may decide I can change that color later. I can always get rid of it too, but it's definitely making a significant difference towards the drawing, right? Even starts to make that pop out a little bit. Since we did tile over here, I do want to show also the metal. So mine will look really weird at the end, but at least we'll cover a lot of things. Let's go ahead and get that metal tile. So I'm gonna embed and metal roof. Way too big. And so we'll shrink that down quite a bit. In fact, we could even line it up with what we have right here. If I couldn't see it too well, of course, I can give it some transparency so I can line that up. If I wanted, maybe this was already in a forced perspective, right? I could hold Alt or Control, depending on, honestly, if you're on Mac, right? But we can force a perspective too, if that happened to have been a perspective. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Right? Or vice versa. Maybe I accidentally got something in perspective, I can make it flat again, right? Anyway, not that we actually have to do that right now, but let's go ahead and line this up at least somewhat. I'm going to go ahead and try and put them in the middle. There we go. Something like that. I could probably shrink it down. That way I don't have to do as much trimming. And, fake it till I make it. Let's just go with that. Right. Enter. Usually when in transform mode, you'll notice that the image is kind of blurry. Just when you press enter, it'll come back again to full resolution. But that's pretty easy to actually erase. So I can go to metal roof. It's going to be like, hey, you need to rasterize this object first. That's fine. Right? That way, of course, I can subtract it. Now, I'm pretty good with my mouse, right? kind of make it look easy. However, you can always use your lasso tool, right, and get a perfect edge, right? In architecture, we're always looking for those perfect straight lines, so of course we do want to be specific. Oh, looks like I went too far. There we go. So I can erase and get rid of not the inside, right, but of course the outside. Erase, yeah, get it just right. Anyway, Command D to deselect, and we got ourselves a metal roof and a tiled roof, right? Not too bad. Next, let's talk about that stone and stucco, right? So I'm about 34 minutes in. We did have a little interruption, but let's try and go for another 20 minutes if we can, or 15. Let's go with 15. But yeah, this stone is actually going to be a little difficult. I have to make a decision, right? I either get rid of these lines completely and start from scratch, or I colorize these, right? So one way to look at it is, well, I might actually be able to just sort of fill it in, right? So in my case, I have to decide some things. Maybe it's a limestone, so I'm going to go with yellows, some oranges, some browns, and things like that. But as you can see, it is quite tedious, right? So, you know, I'll use my brush. We'll have to make a new layer. That way we can call it stone by hand. Of course, it's not actually by hand, but you know, so we can differentiate. But realistically, what I'd want to do is get 0 hardness and just play around with my colors. So I'm going to go with some yellows first. Right? It's more like a off yellow. And quite simply, start not filling it in, right, but keeping that white space, right? And we'll just kind of get this area, right? I am also, keep in mind, very zoomed in, right? So I'm trying to add as much detail at this level, that way when I zoom out, it actually looks a little bit more realistic. So I've got my highlights at least. I have my white, my next darkest element. I'm going to tone it down to maybe a little bit of the oranges, the darkers. I'm going to put it around that color, just like I would in freehand, right? I could add some hardness if, you know, I feel like, you know, I'm not getting a lot of color out, right? And also make it a little bit smaller. That way it's not too much. Want to get in those crevices a little bit, right? Usually it's a little bit darker towards the bottom and the sides to kind of give it that vignette effect, right? So I mean, this is definitely doable. And then usually I go with my lighter colors to my darker colors. And some people go opposite, and that's fine too, but it's just kind of my preference. So I'm gonna go with my dark, then smallen my brush a little bit and kind of get those rich parts, right? Just like you would if you were doing this by hand, right? So get some of that richness in there. And again, trying to be as sketchy as possible. Like I don't even care if there's kind of a little bit of airs like that, right? Because again, I'm trying to almost kind of fool somebody like, look, this is just kind of the representation. I don't want a realistic piece of stone, right, to say the least. But as you can see, this is pretty tedious, right? And I'm going pretty fast and of course talking, but I'd want to get some of those crevices in there. I could even get a little bit darker to really show off that contrast. We can even get we could just get like a big fuzz moment over there. I want a little bit of anomaly, right? Oh, so I turn down my screen. But as you can see, not bad, right? At least for the texture that's already there, right? Now that would look awful if the texture of stone wasn't there, right? I mean, it would just kind of be like, what's this, all this weird color over here? But really not bad once we zoom out, if that is of course white stucco and, you know, seems to work. However, let's talk about some stone if, you know, I do want to start from scratch. So maybe we'll use this area and we'll try some brick on one and maybe some stone on another. So what I would do is of course take those lines and systematically erase them. So I'd use my erase tool and basically just get rid of them, right? I can also hold shift and get a perfectly straight erase, which is kind of nice, right? So I'm gonna just go ahead and remove. Unfortunately, there's not just like a magical way to remove this. I've even tried with AI, and it doesn't know what stone is, right? It's still actually, AI is not really true when they say it's AI, because, well, that would mean that it's an artificial intelligence. Well, there's nothing intelligent about ChatGPT. In fact, it's just really a library of every possible outcome, right? And it's basically just guessing, and it guesses so fast that it looks like it's intelligence. But unfortunately, we're just not there yet. And artificial intelligence is more equivalent to a light switch, of course, right? Just suddenly turning on by itself. I mean, yeah, sentient. Anyway, that's, I kind of left it on the side because, again, I do want this texture, this overall edge texture, right? That would be necessary to at least prove that it's stone. But let's go ahead and maybe do stone or brick first. Did I get a stone? I don't think I got a stone. Anyway, let's do brick first maybe. That's a lot of brick. So obviously, when it comes to brick and stone, what's most important is the scale of it, right? Thank goodness there's a scale figure right here. What's the size of a brick, guys? Anybody know? Yes, right? So you want to get as close as possible, right? Obviously, this would be less correct. We're starting to get there. If that's a man's head, you can almost imagine, 3 bricks per head. And it's about 3 bricks per head, maybe a little bit smaller, right? A little bit more fair. But I basically just want to, again, make sure that I get the boundaries so that I can erase well, right? So I'm gonna try and line it up with one of these edges, right? I don't want sort of these like weird half bricks going on. So I want to try and get, at least to that edge. And of course on the other side, right? I want to get that edge too. So I may have to, squish it a little bit. Fake it till I make it, as the great Escamilla once said. Still says. Let's go ahead and get that. This is what I meant by, you can either do it, of course, with your lines, right? You can get the magic wand tool, and that actually might be kind of nice, with the anomalies in there. Or I can just simply trace it, right? Of course, going to that middle of the line, because I do want the line to win over the texture. After all, the architecture is more important, not the realization that it is brick. So we've got that adjustment. We'll right click and we'll select the inverse so we can get rid of the aftermath. So we'll go ahead and, wrong layer. Want to make sure that it's my brick layer. There it is. Spelled brick wrong, that's all right. Got to rasterize it, that's all right. And of course we can get rid of what we don't need. However, it doesn't stop there, and I was a student too. We want to fuzz it out a little bit. Like I said, we don't need a perfect drawing. So I kind of want to erase some. I need to select my inverse again, get it back into the inside, and basically erase some. Right? I don't want that really hard line, but I also don't want sort of this disappearing effect either. I could start to think of it that way, almost what I would do if it was. Almost like what we're doing with that brick. However, it's harder to achieve without making it look like it's just wrong. So usually what I would do is one big one. Right, something like that. It starts to fade a little bit more rather than like a true gradient or anything like that. Does that make sense, guys? Sort of like fading to the top. All right, we could probably make this part a little bit darker at the bottom, add some texture, things like that. Yeah, it needs some darkness to it, I think. So, actually, let's get that back. You can Command Z if you accidentally lose your selection. That's like the worst thing in Photoshop. You did like all this tracing and then you accidentally click somewhere and you're like, crap, I gotta do that all over again. Thankfully, if you do Command Z, undo, you can get that selection back. Anyway, let's add some burn tool in there, see what these guys do. There's a smudge tool. Let's go with that burn tool. I kind of like that darkness that it adds. Makes it a little bit more real. And again, I play with it. Right? It's a little dirty. It's more like Toy Story 4, right? But again, that starts to make it, of course, much more realistic. Now, in an ideal situation, I would have done this all to my brick at once, right? Obviously, I wouldn't do that one little piece at a time. Maybe last but not least, I think we get an idea of how to fill in some stuff. This one's going to be nice and fun. What I would recommend for that is quite literally just trace it, right? Get the whole piece. Because I would work smarter, not harder, right? But I'd still work harder. But then I would hold command and actually subtract, right? That way, I don't necessarily get another window. I don't want stucco in there. And I'm just sort of loosely doing this right now. Of course, you'd be much more specific. You could use the lasso tool or anything. But basically subtracting from that. So again, I could brush this in. Maybe it's a stucco. We'll go really big. We'll kind of go for maybe like an off yellow. Stucco's usually not perfectly white. A little bit bigger than that. Let's get my new layer. Call it stucco. I'm just kind of blur that in. Kind of want it a little darker at the bottom. But see, yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. There are parts about this that are much easier than trying to color that in by hand, right? I mean, done, right? Maybe I don't want to get rid of my shadow too much, but see what I mean? Stucco, right? But it's again that fuzziness, that white quality, that it's not just filled in, right? It's not just maxed out on color and vibrance. It's subtle, to say the least, right? Last but not least, maybe let's talk about getting some trees in there. What I would recommend is drawing your own trees and splitting them right in there, especially if you do this analog, right? However, if you do it digitally, a digital tree definitely does look better. What I would say is pick one. It looks ridiculous to put digital trees and analog trees right next to each other, right? So that's kind of just the go-to rules right there. But just in case you didn't know, there is pimpmydrawings.com. Are you guys aware? Good. It's got a lot of free content. It is actually an architectural student, maybe a previous architecture student. Oh God, I don't know what I clicked on. Don't just type in pimpmydrawings.com. How about that? We'll go to Google and go to Pimp My Drawings. Really surprised that it would even let you go there on the school's Wi-Fi. Anyway, there's the correct one, pimpmydrawing.com. I don't know why that went somewhere else. Anyway, but yeah, he's got other scale figures. You got people, trees. We're looking for specifically trees. And what's nice is they come in as an AI file or a DWG. Both of those will open up in Photoshop, right? However, they come in purple and blue, right? So you might not want that. I would recommend opening these in Illustrator, changing the line weight a bit, then sliding it over to Photoshop, right, to be colored in. Another way to do it is, well, like I said, finding one that already exists. So Google Images, we'll say architectural tree in elevation, right? So architectural, spelled architectural wrong. But yeah, something like this, is usable as long as it doesn't have all these things in there. You could draw better trees than that. Like what the hell is that? Anyway, I'm gonna go with these kind of black and white trees. I kind of like that. However, it doesn't look like it's a very big image. That actually looks pretty nice too. They look more digital / kind of analog to them. So we'll go ahead and do that. Awesome. Love it. I'm gonna go ahead and save image as. We'll call it trees. And I want a strong ground line here too. After all, it is an elevation. So, I mean, there's two ways I can do it. I can make straight lines in Photoshop. I forget how though. There is a line tool. However, another way to do it is, of course, just getting the whole thing, because that will make a straight line. I do want my ground plane because it's starting to look like it's just kind of floating. I'm kind of getting sick of that weird color at the bottom. So I'm going to go with ground. right? And fill that in. So we know our ground is not true black, but very dark. I'm gonna go ahead and use my brush tool and brush that right in. I'm gonna kind of fade it in there. Usually I like the darkest part really at the top, and get it even a little darker. Like I said, kind of want that, I want difference, right? It doesn't necessarily always have to be a gradient, right? I can't tell you how sick I get of just people sticking gradients under there, right? Give it some artistry, right? Make it your own. Make it absolutely different from everybody else's, and they couldn't possibly copy it ever. But yeah, that's starting to look pretty strong. However, it's pretty dark, and I know that's going to print super dark. So what I would do is lighten it up a little bit. However, I can't do that, right? Because it starts to show the other stuff. So what I could do is actually, like we were speaking about earlier, just change the brightness. Kind of a poopy color, but I know it'll print well. That's what starts to get really hard about this. You're like, just wait till the print, just wait till the print, right? It looks kind of awful for a second. But let's get those trees in there, start talking about some context. Obviously this would apply to other scale figures and things like that. And maybe we do like, kind of a small tutorial at the end on Monday or something too. Let's see. Oh yeah, we already got the trees. So let's go ahead, and I'm actually going to open that file first because there was actually a few trees in there. It's also a WEP, which is not an image file. That's unfortunate. We got to get a new file. Either that or I saved it wrong. You could sometimes get away with this, right? So if you type in like trees.jpg and you use JPEG, sometimes it'll work. So I mean, let's check that out. Yeah, never mind. We tried. However, those are good trees. These are CAD trees, technically digital. And honestly, it's pretty hard to find a good tree. That's why I'd recommend honestly drawing your own. That way it's, a little bit more special. That's a nice tree. Free download. But as you can see, clearly where we're going with this. That one looks pretty good. Very realistic trees. Maybe we show what not to do, right? However, this would be good for the digital guys. Is there anybody who's already, or they've decided that they're going to digitally trace theirs? Good. Yeah, so maybe this one's kind of for y'all. Save image as. Very realistic trees, but we kind of want to dumb that down a little bit. Like I said, we're not trying to just, make category art. But yeah, we'll get the trees in there, call it a day. Let's go ahead and open it. Like I said last time, there's a lot of trees in there. You really want to isolate them one at a time, right? So for instance, I could get rid of the background. So I can get rid of all that white. I don't have to use a magic wand tool. Can you imagine how long it would take to get that out? The white space out of there anyway. All right, so I'm just gonna go to multiply. All right, and of course decrease the white. Look like magic, man. Anyway, don't wanna get rid of too much. However, if I'm trying to make something a less realistic, that would be a really good way to do it. All right, I'm sort of fuzzing the tree out a little bit, starts to look a little bit more like a tree. Does that make sense? Right? Again, kind of making it my own. Right? And maybe it actually allows the architecture to come through that a little bit better as well. So I'm going to take that and take this tree. I'm going to go ahead and copy it, so Command C. I may have to do the blending options. I don't think it saves it over. Yeah, it doesn't. But that's okay. Blending option is pretty easy. Hold Shift to make that, of course, proportional, and kind of set them up, right? Obviously, I'd want to erase some of these things first, the other trees involved. A little blurry until I hit enter, but again, we can take that tree, right click, blending options, multiply, and take it down a bit. However, I can't see it, so I'm gonna have to just go with it. I think I took it down a little bit more. There we go. Not bad. However, I do want some transparency to that tree. That's a little bit more appropriate. Maybe we're trying to actually mimic this tree right here. So Let's go ahead and do that. I could skew it a little bit, right? After all, I don't want everything to be perfect. And only really I would know, right, if it was skewed. But we kind of want to line that up too. So we'll keep it there. I could still sort of erase portions of it, right, if it's starting to get a little too much in some areas. I could do that, however, that's pretty harsh. So maybe I'd want to take that down a notch, right? I could add some stuff too. However, I probably wouldn't do that. It's still too harsh. So again, the best way to do it is actually to get bigger and actually get a little bit farther away. So check this out, right? We got a big swatch here, but it's still, even though I'm not really near the tree, I can start to fuzz it out. And obviously the bigger I get, it's kind of hard. It goes like from honestly 500 to 6,000 really quick. But yeah, something like that. See how I kind of fuzz the tree out just a little bit. However, we don't want to suddenly make it look like the tree's behind it if the tree is actually in fact in front of it. We don't want this weird MC Escher situation where the tree is both in front and behind the building, right? We don't want to do anything too impossible. So maybe I don't get rid of too much. Maybe I fuzz it out a little bit more. Again, that magic number 42 or 40. But it's really starting to get somewhere. Maybe I want that shadow to be on the building, kind of right here at the bottom. Let's go ahead and do that because it's really easy in Photoshop and I like kind of showing off sometimes. So I'm going to duplicate that layer. I'm going to call it the tree shadow. We'll take that one. If we know anything about shadows, we know they get all sort of squished a little bit. And since we know the shadow's going this direction, we'll say that the tree is casting onto the building. Relatively low, right? I'm going to blacken it out, right? So of course I have to enter first, image, adjustments. I can make it black and white. So if I go to black and white, usually I select automatic, right? So we kind of have this dark shadow, right? And obviously erase the part that I don't need. Not too bad. Of course I can make that a little bit darker. Obviously not too dark. Right? If that was maybe a little too much, I could also bring it down a little bit and erase. Obviously too much fuzz. Let's try that again. Maybe a harder line and a lot less. Maybe I want to cut that off first, then erase. However, it's kind of weird because, it looks like I need to actually maybe move my stone back. There we go. See what, obviously I need to pay attention to those layers as well. But yeah, better. Hopefully learn something new for sure. Sweet. We'll go ahead and end it there for today, unless there are specific questions you want me to address. Maybe that you're already running into. I would start writing them down, guys, because trust me, you're going to run into something like, I want to do this, but I'm settling for this, right? That's going to come up a lot. Just because I know you're creative and you're trying to achieve something that you just haven't achieved yet, right? So have those questions for next week, right? Write them down and just continue with what you can. But if there's no questions, I'll go ahead and end the recording here.